Hi, welcome back to Wildrose Country. We are moving into episode 3, which means that we're in a little different timeline. Right now, you can see we're at the Red Deer River, and we're going to imagine that aside from the running river, the geese that are newly home and the ducks alongside them, there are rolling green hills, lots of buffalo grass, and now hundreds of Blackfoot encampments with the Blackfoot Nation mounted on horseback. It's 1793. Dozens of Blackfoot warriors rode confidently on horseback, a surprising revelation to Henday, whose Cree guides had only traveled on foot. In fact, his Cree companions grew nervous. They knew the Blackfoot, whom Henday called Archithinues, were traditional enemies of the Cree. So imagine the tension as they walked into the camp, surrounded by curious eyes and warriors atop what some Cree called Mistatum, the big dogs. This is the Red Deer River. And this is one of the main areas where it's easy to pinpoint on a map where explorers first discovered Central Alberta. One such was Anthony Henday. It was October 14th of 1754 when he crested a nearby hill and discovered, to his count, 322 Blackfoot lodges. With his Cree guides, he would approach the Blackfoot with caution, and again, on account of the HBC, try to trade. By the 1790s, the European race for the West was in full swing. The Hudson's Bay Company, long content to trade at Hudson's Bay, now faced a fierce competitor, the Northwest Company of Montreal. The Nor'westers, as HBC people called them, were dynamic, French-speaking traders pushing deep into indigenous territories, and the result was a fur trade rivalry that was as intense on the Central Alberta plains as anywhere in North America. Cartographers coming through the area used big landmarks that really stood out from a distance. Any kind of hill, river, and especially river crossings and confluences to mark distances on their maps. And they would come back repeatedly and test their compasses to make sure that their readings matched and that they were coming back to the same spot over and again. They also used astronomy, charting the direction and the distance traveled by the sun and the moon and certain stars like Polaris to tell them which direction they'd been traveling and keep them on the straight path. It was pretty tough given the abundance of forests and the unavailability of trails like these and big roads. So a lot of it was down to dead reckoning, in which you would just walk, estimate your speed, estimate your time, probably by the sun, and then use that to trace the exact distance on your map. you'd have to go back and forth over this several times to check it, which is why the maps that we see before this period are so squished and awkward. It took more cartographers combing over the area again and again to really get the full picture of how huge Canada was, because nobody really knew until somebody reached the end of it.
Polaris is a circumpolar star, which means that it's always in the sky and won't set or rise. A navigator would use a sextant to measure the altitude of Polaris above the horizon, and the result gives you your latitude. These were the methods used by early map makers like Peter Fiddler when he created this, the first map, the first documented paper map of Central Alberta. You can see on this larger map, one of the first of Canada, how squished everything is because nobody knew quite how long the continent was. And just 1 or 2 years later, after Alexander Mackenzie reached the edge of Canada, you get this much better looking map.
So, in this time period, the recipe we're focusing on is Bannock, or a version of Bannock. This, we're starting with finely ground but whole grain wheat. You can see how it's actually got the chaff in there instead of just being filtered into pure white. So this is not only better for you, but it's closer to what people would have worked with a few hundred years ago. And the addition of wheat is actually interesting because Bannock was probably corn-based for certain areas a long time ago, but when the Scots and the English and other European people came this way, they brought flour, like wheat flour. Because in Alberta at this time, wheat didn't actually exist like this. It was taken on eventually for recipes like this. But this is kind of a play on the Scottish scone or biscuit, as maybe Southern Americans would call it, that recipe. So this is basically a scone. We're taking the flour, adding in some salt and baking powder. Baking powder is the only leavening in this, so it's not going to rise like a yeast dough, but it's not going to be a flatbread either. So we're going to get this nicely mixed in as evenly as possible, and then work in some fat and water. The fat that I'm using here is actually walnut oil. Walnuts aren't big in Alberta, but they do come from BC. So if we're going to assume that people were trading back and forth, walnut oil could be a thing, or chunks of walnuts in this as well, which just gives it such a nice flavor, and this is really good for us. So let's see, we're just gonna look for a certain texture here to make a crumb before adding in the water. And this can be, again, any kind of fat. Bread and pastry making is all about the ratio of your flour, your fat, and your water, and whether or not you're using leavening and salt. So I wanted to get enough of a crumb that this can stick together without being really wet when I put in the water. That looks pretty good. The thing about making a scone or a bannock, or this is also called fry bread often,
is that you don't want to overwork it because it'll turn out hard and more like a hockey puck than a nice, soft, tasty pastry. At this point, it's okay to work quite a bit because as you see, it's turning into a crumb when we work the fat into the wheat flour. So now we'll just see if we could get the right amount of water. We'll add this carefully. And again, it's easy to see why this recipe has really persisted in a lot of places because it's simple. And once traders started coming in with different kinds of food ingredients, including wheat flour, it's so easy to do and pretty affordable at any time where wheat was abundant. Okay, I'm gonna start doing this with my hands to get it nice. And again, this is the point where we really don't want to overwork it. We could definitely try this with a corn flour as well, which would come up with something a little more akin to what we know as cornbread. So try to get all of the bits combined while not completely breaking all of the crumb that we've created. Just want to get it to sort of come together without being too flaky. Something like that. And then we're gonna let that sit for maybe 10 or 20 minutes before we put it on a grill or in the oven or in a pan or however really you'd like to do this. We've waited long enough. The gluten has done its thing, become nice and pliable, a little bit stretchy, which is the beautiful, beautiful thing about wheat. So in this case, I'm just gonna push it into the pan like this, because mine is gonna be baked. It's just a wee little guy. It's fun to do it over the fire as well, and you can definitely do it in a pan or on a griddle. It's always going to turn out nicely. You just put the right ratio and a little bit above. And if you wanted to do it a little bit more like a scone or a sweet fry bread, you can add sugar into that recipe. Maybe even start with just a tablespoon or the same of honey or maple syrup and go from there. This is what I'm going for. And this is our fry bread. Not technically fried, but you know what I mean. This is our Bannock. It's nice with a little bit of raspberry jam. And yes, raspberries do grow here, so. Awesome. That walnut oil really brings something to it. Like, if you've never tried baking with walnut oil, give this a try because this is awesome. I'm gonna hand you a piece. Just take it. Here you go. Okay.
He was the first European explorer to have traveled from the Atlantic to the Pacific. When he got there, he sat down and wrote his name on a rock. At the time, tens of thousands of buffalo were still roaming the prairies, and it was really them and other big herds that shaped the environment and the landscape. Whereas now, it's agriculture. Natives would hunt with bow and arrow, the buffalo, and use the entire thing, as I'm sure you've heard in school. They would use the entire thing, meat, fur, sinew for bowstrings. Every little thing was used that was possible. And when the white people came, they saw it as mostly something for coats and meat. They weren't very much interested in any other parts of the buffalo except for huge skeletons which they could bring back and show off to people. So when an explorer came through, yeah, it was really hard work. They really suffered through the cold, and even in the summertime, there were predators. They would run out of food because no amount of oats would make it all the way over here. So they had to make friends, and they would make friends with different people from different tribes across Canada who could tell them things like what there was to eat, what they should not be eating, what predators to look out for, where they could camp, where they could not camp, where a warrior tribe was waiting and where a peaceful tribe might be to help them. So they did not do this by themselves. What the lack of history documents from Indigenous groups means is that it's far too easy to put together a history of this place and a lot of other places that completely discredit the local people. Because I can look through a history book and I can read about the English people and the French people and the German people eventually and the Dutch people eventually and all of the people who came who had a system of writing and liked to write things down and keep them documented. And obviously those stories were told from their own point of view, which is great. A first-person perspective on any part of history is really awesome as a historian or working with archaeologists. But we're completely missing huge pieces of the story. And I can't find that in a book necessarily. Maybe I can find it in a couple. Maybe I can find it if I ask the right people. But who are the right people? Do they want to talk to me? Often they really don't care.